Good morning and welcome to the Space Madness podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Nasanov, and I have with me today John Anderson from Hush Blackwell to talk about a really interesting subject, kind of different than what we usually talk about, but something really important and timely. Now, the subject of today's episode is going to be about labor law in general and how that applies to NASA and JPL and other scientific organizations. So, with that, John, please go ahead and introduce yourself and the firm.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm John Anderson. I'm a labor employment attorney for the last 40 plus years. I'm currently the office managing partner of a regional office of Hush Blackwell, a firm based in Missouri. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you, Jeff.
Great. Well, thank you. And likewise. And one of the reasons I thought to do an episode on this subject is because it's really never been a question about unionizing at NASA centers and contractors, almost ridiculously so. I could never have imagined it when I was an employee of JPL in 2010 to 2014 timeframe. But, the world has changed and the nation has changed in some ways that make this subject important and timely, perhaps even more so than I thought when we scheduled this, because just yesterday or the day before, JPL put up a website very reminiscent of signs and warning against unionization. And so we'll get to that. Now, I do want to say that the information in this podcast is not legal advice. I'm not telling you should organize or not. The goal is to explore this new world we find ourselves in. Not the type of new world we usually want to explore at NASA, but here we are. So, John, I wonder if you could start us off with basic 101 labor law in the U.S. As a small tangent, this is an interesting overlap for me of my two worlds, space and law. I do have two law degrees. I took employment law, and then I went to work at JPL. So it's actually a very comfortable area for me, but one that is perhaps uncommon and underexposed to the majority of the audience. And I'll shut up in a moment after I share one employment law thought that I'll never forget, which is that employment law as a field, as I understand it, or really even the concept of employee rights, it never even existed in human history until the Black Plague wiped out so many workers in Europe that the surviving ones actually had some leverage. So from that perspective, I'll hand it over to you, John, and maybe you can connect that to modern day America or maybe recent history in America.
I can do that. There's really no constitutional right, if you will, to form a union. The ability to form a union is statutory, and there are numerous states throughout the country that give employees rights to form unions. Normally, that would be preempted by what we call the National Labor Relations Act that was adopted in the 1930s, covers most private sector employers. There's also the ability of government workers to organize, the federal government workers to organize under the Federal Labor Management Relations Program. So under those three aspects, state law or federal law for federal employees or federal law for all employees, generally they provide the same rights. So there's a right to organize a union. Employees have the right to form, join, or assist labor organizations and engage in collective bargaining through the representatives that they choose, and they have the right to not do that as well. They have the right to engage in protected concerted activities, which is basically two or more employees coming together and acting for their mutual aid or protection. So the Black Plague type situation. That includes discussing wages, hours, and conditions of employment. Not everything that you could ever think of can be negotiated, but wages, hours, and conditions of employment can. And then various aspects of these law provides for employees or unions to file unfair labor practices should the employer interfere. And the key to this whole area, Jeff, that we've talked about and that we're talking about today is to figure out who the employer is, because that's very critical in determining which statute you're under and whether you have collective bargaining rights at all.
Okay. So really it's been less than 100 years in the US that this has even been an option. And of course the history of the 20th century is rich with worker organization efforts and opposition to it. I think far beyond the far beyond the scope of this episode, although a very interesting subject. I just want to take a step even further back to almost a first principles question, which is, what is a union? And I think the answer to that will be important, actually, because it is something separate from the employees themselves.
It is and it isn't. Union
Okay.
is a union is a collective representation of a group of employees who are interested in advancing their interests. The
Okay.
union there's a union organizational structure, but ultimately, and I think most union folks that are organizing unions would say, the union really is the people.
Okay.
So it's like, you build a church is great, but the church is not the building that you built, it's the people
Sure.
in the church. So that's kind of what a union is. A union is really a structure that's applied to a group of employees who have similar interests and want to work together to protect those interests, advance their cause, better their lives, or whatever.
So thank you for that. One of the reason I phrase it that way is because the website that was put up this week by presumably JPL or Caltech, it states that a union is a third party separate from the people, empowered to make decisions for the people. So that's why I phrase it that way. So I don't want to jump all the way to that subject, but I wonder if you could shed a little bit of light on that particular phrasing, characterizing union as something separate from the people
Yeah,
in a legal sense.
that's a very typical employer or management definition of a union. I've gotten past that many times. Obviously, if employees want to organize a union, they're going to organize a union. There's nothing that an employer can do to stop that generally.
Mm,
The employer doesn't get a vote in that process. It's the employees that vote. So to the extent that management can create an environment, and often does, and I've done this when I represent employers, is to make sure that you try to distinguish between the union as a corporate entity and your workers, who would never in their right mind think that having a union is a good idea, because it interjects this third party between the employer and the employees.
sure.
So that there's a balance that's struck there. Obviously, the union's view of the world is we are the people that work for you, and the employer's view of the union is, well, the union is this third party outsider who doesn't care a bit about our business.
Okay. Yeah, I think that distinction goes back throughout the history of labor unions in the United States, I think communicated in different ways over the years. So getting back to the kind of historical picture of all of this, the 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 National Labor Relations Act was an act of Congress, presumably by the word act in it in the 30s, and originating in the power of the Congress under the Constitution to pass acts like that. Oh, just to get back to first principles for a moment, but getting back to the present day, it hasn't typically been an issue whether NASA employees or FFRDC employees, we'll define that in a moment, could or should organize. And the reason, I think, is for many decades there was an implicit trade-off when you went to work for a utility or a government agency or a research facility like that. You were giving up something, which is presumably higher wages in the private sector, in exchange for something like a security of sorts, job security or a mission to work for. And I believe that stood fairly strong for decades and decades, notwithstanding some ups and downs. But it's kind of a new situation for all that NASA Center people are even facing this question.
Well, I think you're right. I think that the stability that's normally associated with government employment has been rocked by current events, and so with that disruption that comes employees looking to find other protections that are available to them. And the union is something that offers that. Whether they can deliver on that remains to be seen, especially in this situation where you're trying to organize a union. It's like when all this is going on, it's like building an airplane that's going down the runway, building it while it's
Yeah,
on the runway moving.
yeah,
The ability to affect is usually a year into the future, not
I
immediate.
see. Well, and it's an interesting analogy you used. That exact same analogy is often used in the space mission development actually process, where if you have an opportunity to propose to, sometimes you design something to a deadline rather than something else. So it literally is, it's the exact same analogies. So one of the many overlaps of law and engineering that I've come to appreciate. Let's get back to a really important issue that you hinted at, which is, who these laws apply to and when. So I mentioned FFRDC, Federally Funded Research and Development Center, a category of organization all over the country. I believe that first took its distinct form in the World War II era, not federal employees, as opposed to NASA federal employees, civil servants themselves. So just those two, just that distinction, what do people need to know?
Well, interestingly enough, the question ultimately is, are they federal employees? And that sometimes is difficult to determine, because I think even with like JPL, there's federal employees working side by side with employees that are not federal employees. Federal civilian employees, it's pretty clear. When you get into other types of employees, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But who the employer is critical, and often not as clear as we'd want it to be. I would assume that a good starting point when you're dealing with an FFRDC is to look at the agreement that established that, because that's a relationship between the government and an entity, college or university, or a private company, or both. And to the extent that you can get yourself out of the idea that it's you are federal employees, then the National Labor Relations Act applies, which is a broad sweeping act where most unions operate under. There is the American Federation of Government Employees, which is the union for federal employees, but that's the union that had several contracts canceled a couple of weeks ago.
So getting to what I think is the most complicated situation of all of these, which is the JPL itself. Federal Research Lab, operated by a university, Caltech, a nonprofit, with enormous numbers of federal contracts, federal and commercial contracts, in a workplace with Caltech employees, JPL employees, federal civil servants, and there are several offices at JPL with civil servants there, and certainly contractors and all of that. But JPL does seem to me like the most possible complicated overlapping of all of that. So I'm curious from a interested party's point of view, how do you even begin to unravel that? I'll add that there is a prime contract document that governs Caltech's management of JPL that I'm sure has interesting details in it. But how does one start to unravel all of that when there's so many layers?
I think you look at it from the standpoint of a very practical perspective to begin with. Who is my supervisor? Who is providing me with guidance on a day-to-day basis? Where do I get my paycheck from? I mean, those types of things are indicia of an employment relationship. When you're trying to navigate through this, it's kind of a public-private partnership situation. But taking a look at those types of things is important. Asking questions. It's important to ask questions as to, who is the employer here? There might be 2 or 3 different employers going on, but I think when you get down to it, JPL is likely to be considered a private employer, which would be subject to the National Labor Relations Act unless specifically excluded. And there's not much there. Federal law, Federal Labor Management Relations Program, specifically excludes certain agencies, like the National Security Agency, the FBI, the CIA, those types of things. But the National Labor Relations Act doesn't typically do that. So I think asking questions, figuring out, who is my employer at a practical level, who's a supervisor. A supervisor sometimes is within the same company, but other times could be contracted. So it makes a very difficult assessment. But looking and seeing where where you're getting your W-2 from. People at JPL are probably not getting a W-2 from the federal government. They're probably getting it from JPL or Caltech. So I mean that's not necessarily the the only way to determine whether an employer is there, but that's a practical way to determine.
Sure. So there's a couple of other questions that come to my mind from that, which is the actual work performed at JPL is funded under a enormous patchwork of grants and contracts and assignments between other federal agencies, NASA itself, private companies, international agreements between universities. Is there a point at which that patchwork of funding and resources comes into play where an argument can be made that someone is no longer even a JPL or Caltech employee, but rather working for someone else? And could that matter?
I will never say never, because we've seen things happen in the last 6 months that we never thought could happen. But I question whether or not, through the myriad of contracts that establish an entity and the work that an entity does like JPL, whether those contracts can be used as a means of defining who is or
Okay.
who is not eligible for union status. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's if you're a private company, you can organize under the National Labor Relations Act. If you're a governmental entity, unless you're excluded, you can organize under the Federal Labor Management Relations Program. If you're a partnership between the federal government, still the partnership is at a high level. There's still an organizational structure that defines what each part of that partnership do. So it seems to me that there's going to be an employer in every situation. And I don't believe that an employer can contract with the federal government and give up the rights of its employees. I think that that would be unusual if that.
Okay.
Ultimately, a court might have to decide that, but it seems that an employee is an employee is an employee, and you can't say that you're coming to work under this project and you're no longer our employee or an employee of somebody else.
Sure. Yeah.
By coming to work, you're giving up the rights that you have under the statutes.
Right. Okay. So I want to get to a more practical level, which is so the way JPL is funded is largely project by project. So there could be the Mars rover that landed in 2021 or 22, and that was paid for by NASA, congressional appropriation to NASA, processed through the NASA system and allocated to JPL over a period of years. And it seems to me that if Congress doesn't do that, and there isn't a mission, and there's a huge hole in the JPL budget, the union isn't going to help much because there's no work to do. And I'm reminded of opinions I've read that, oh, unions ruined the automotive industry or what have you. And, if you pay someone $75 to turn a wrench, then the company is going to go out of business because it's just not worth that much. And I'm not taking a position on that, to be clear. But it does seem to me that if a union negotiates its wages so high that a company cannot pay them, that is not a sustainable situation. But I'm curious, in the case of a federally funded project-based organization like JPL, I mean, what practical purpose could organizing actually achieve if there's no next rover? And so a quarter of the budget is gone.
I think you've hit on a good point. Obviously, an employer decides how much labor the employer needs to purchase based on the work that it has contracted to do or that it is doing as part of its normal course of business. And if there's no work, really the union can't stop you from laying people off or right sizing, if you will. What a union can do, though, is perhaps negotiate with the employer over benefits or processes that minimize or mitigate against the impact of those staff reductions. So they could
Okay.
negotiate a provision that talks about, if we have to reduce staff, what's the process for reducing staff? How are we going to
I
do
see.
that? What benefits do they get if they are laid off? And those types of process issues. I've seen contracts that say you can't lay people off. I don't never agree to that as an employer's representative because that's not a practical thing. I think everybody understands that in a situation like JPL, work is dependent upon projects. And, over the course of history, projects have been forthcoming and regular, and people have had good careers and lengthy careers working in that environment. You said something earlier that was interesting, and that is that, if the union negotiates wage rates that are too high, the company can't, it's not sustainable. Well, ultimately, it's a negotiation, and the union can't negotiate rates that the company doesn't agree to. So it's not pointing fingers at the union here. It's the both parties are responsible for that, and perhaps if there's mistakes made, there were joint mistakes made during that process.
Yeah, and I'm not taking a position on that so much as I'm trying to apply the thinking that I think is part of the American zeitgeist about unions to the very non-market based economy of space missions, right? It's not a informed buyer and seller of goods that I would think most people's awareness of unions has applied to. So, and it reminds me of discussions I've read and were even part of 10 plus years ago of trying to wonder, I would often wonder what's next after this rover and how does the next mission get assigned? And for decades, with some ups and downs again, there was always a next big mission that I now know, emerged from a complicated discussion of scientific priorities, national priorities, budget fights, political capital, countless other variables. And I think that was reliable enough for 50 years that it seemed inevitable. And so I certainly understand that people at JPL wanting to do whatever is available to them to pursue some semblance of protection, right? And when I first heard about all of this, I couldn't help but wonder, is that the best use of their efforts to preserve the institution and its work? And that's just a very different situation. Nobody's trying to preserve Ford Motor Company for its own sake, right? So I wonder from your perspective, what's the closest example that you can talk about to this kind of weird non-market based kind of exchange of labor and capital and resources and all of that?
I think a lot of it turns on looking at the quality and experience of the workforce, and that you're correct. It's not really based on the market at all. It's based on we need these skilled scientists and researchers to be able to make sure that we can accomplish what we need to accomplish over the course of a period of time. Now, we may be impacted by things that are outside our control, or some are certainly outside our control in terms of the funding that's available, the priorities that the government has moving forward. And the other thing is, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that there's a huge lead time. Projects that are being worked on today may not have some practical application to some government interest for several years. So you've always got you always got some type of a lag between work and research and conceptions and models and developing
Well, that's absolutely true, and it goes back to the job of the administrator of JPL, which I think or the director rather, that we can I think get into. That is a big part of this discussion. I think for a lot of people at JPL maybe are so focused on their already nearly impossible job of sending robots to Pluto, for example, that there's a sort of inherent trust in the leadership or the nation itself that the next big thing will come, right? But that has never been inevitable. It has always been a discussion between NASA and the director of JPL, the directors over the years, and Caltech and the National Academies of Science and so on. And missions are negotiated over many years as the outcome of previous missions takes shape and emerging scientific priorities develop and change. And again, it gets to this kind of unique in the history of NASA where this unique situation where there's just a big gap coming up, and it's the job of the administration of JPL and the director to fill those gaps and to avoid them, but they are ultimately limited in what they can offer to the employees, it seems to me, by those larger forces, like I said, like Congress and administration, executive priorities, and so on. And so I think that yet maybe is a similar wrinkle, but it's definitely a big wrinkle in the thinking of applying worker organization to the employer.
I think you're right. I think it's a complicating factor because the work is not steady necessarily. It's project based, and your employment is to a certain degree predicated on the next project that's coming down the
Hmm.
road. I'm a lawyer. I do the work that I have today, but I'm not terribly worried about that. I'm worried about what am I going to do tomorrow
Hmm.
or next week or next year. Um, and I don't know that a union can change that cycle. I think that certainly that's be an issue that would be subject to discuss at the bargaining table because it deals with wages, hours, and conditions of employment and whether somebody's going to be continuing or what their status is going to be moving forward. But those are all issues that smart people can figure out solutions for if the employees are choosing a union. If they choose a union, then
Yeah.
you deal with it. If they choose not to, then you deal with that too. And I think that the leadership at JPL and Caltech, based on what I read yesterday, are very coy in putting up a website that we can talk about. But
Hmm.
if you dig deeper into it, they really don't want a union there. The leaders don't. They don't want to offend anybody by saying that,
Yeah.
but they don't want to have one. And that's a pretty typical employer response. This isn't going to help us any. It's just going to complicate life.
Yeah, and a few weeks before that, there was the pro union website that had a list of employees as a sort of call to organization, and I want to get into that sort of back and forth. But something else occurred to me along the way this conversation, which is that one of the big questions among JPLers, even former, is how are these layoffs being who's deciding who gets laid off? And that takes me to one of your points, which was that even if a union cannot summon the next Mars mission from the ether, it could perhaps maybe shed some light on how these very difficult decisions are being made. Because as I've heard, it appears to be totally random, and of course that's not fair to anyone, and nobody is satisfied by that. So now, as you said, that is not something that's going to be solved for this round of layoffs by unionizing now, but I can certainly sympathize with employees wanting greater visibility into that in the future. Is that something you see in organizations where the union can't really affect the work coming in, but it can increase the transparency within?
I think that's an important thing, and I think that that's also a common strategy of employers who want to resist the unionization effort. Is the best union election is one that's never held, and so the employer needs to engage its employees, needs to create a level of trust and transparency so they feel like they don't need a union. And doing that is sharing information about what the challenges that are facing the company, sharing information that, we're paying competitively, avoiding antitrust issues, but certainly
Hmm.
we're paying competitively and we treat our employees well as a means of encouraging people not to walk down the path of unionization. Right now, this is like sovereign immunity. Companies not unionized, the company makes all those types of decisions. Good companies
Hmm.
will engage folks to get information from them about, what they'd like to see happen, knowing that we need to cut our budget by $50 million. How are we going to do that? And some companies don't see the value of that, and they're going to make those decisions themselves. And when they do, they need to make those decisions based on objective, concrete subjectivity, and they need to be able to do it in a way that they can explain to workers. Otherwise, those
Hmm.
decisions will be challenged through traditional means of that. You don't have a union contract, you can't file a grievance saying you laid off the
Yeah.
wrong person. But why am I getting laid off? It seems like you're laying off all the old folks. Now that's an age
Yeah.
discrimination issue, or you're laying off the folks that are brown skinned again,
Or
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 some
the
other
people.
criteria.
Yeah, and I realize the following is not a protected class, but the people who are remote workers or
Right,
or what have
which
you.
is a
So
big deal. Remote workers are
yeah,
a big deal.
yeah, and one of that transparency, I don't think anyone would say is controversial to say that transparency is totally lacking. And it's an environment where you perhaps have the greatest diversity of skill sets anywhere on earth, where you have one person in office one that is an expert on the icy moons of Neptune, and in the next office you have someone who's an expert at high temperature plasma physics around stars. And so again, I come back to applying these traditional thoughts of transparency and worker and organizational rights is very, very challenging. And I think that in the Caltech JPL relationship for the last 50 years, I don't think it's ever come up to this degree.
I'm certain it hasn't. There's been plenty of work for everybody. When the employer's going to have to make decisions as to what work it's going to do and what work it's going to defer, with the risk that if it defers the work, they're going to lose talented people that they may never get back. And so it's an issue of, and transparency is lovely to talk about, but again, with that airplane running down the runway and it's going to take off in 2 weeks and you've got to make some decisions pretty quickly, it's very difficult. Oftentimes it's impossible to make the right decision. If you would have had a year to plan for this, maybe
Sure.
it's a more likely that a good decision will be made. I mean, and I think there's varying degrees of good. You just want to make sure you're not making a bad decision.
Right, right. And you talked about wages earlier, and I haven't really highlighted that, but one of the challenges for a lot of people is the cost of living in Los Angeles. And a bigger challenge, I think, is having a mission to work on in the first place, but in the calculus of the organization, trying to manage the cost of missions themselves, which are always expensive because we're doing things that have never been done before in human history. It's just another variable in the complexity here of managing these organizations in this environment. And I'm not without sympathy for that, because part of my job is helping organizations win missions, and knowing that, like, for example, a mission launched on Wednesday that I was a proposal manager for at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab 7 years ago. And it was I think, $520 million mission. And a great amount of that is labor that is going to pay people's salaries for 10 years. So I know what it takes to get money in and how opaque that can look to the people getting paid the money, because they have bigger issues. They have more important issues, like understanding the fundamental nature of the universe, right? I would like to be in a world where people with those skills can just do that work and not have to worry about it. But that's not the world. Not the world that we have. So let's talk about the couple of websites that we mentioned. There was a website put up encouraging organization with a bunch of individual worker names on it. I'm curious, is that basically the modern version of the board that would be put up at a factory, saying you don't want to miss out?
I think the board would never have been put up around the factory.
Okay.
The union organizing in the days of old was you gather around the water cooler at break time, and when the manager would walk around the corner, you would disperse like
Okay.
mice running under the refrigerator.
Yeah.
That's changed. Most of the union organizing that I'm seeing today is done underground. The employer's not aware of it. It's done through social media. It's done through meetings that are held elsewhere. Very rarely are we dealing with issues like there's a union organizer in the parking lot or those types of things. It's all pretty well organized, and unions do a very good job of getting the word out, especially if, in the context of the website you've referenced, we have employees that are willing to put their names on it. That, one, shows courage, and two, it's also a smart thing to do, because then, to the extent that the company knows about it, and the company probably does, because there's always people talking behind the scenes as to what's going on, those folks get the protections under the act, that's two or more people together working together. It's called protected concerted activity. So you want to get that out in the open so that the company knows that this organizing drive is going on. That may steer some companies to avoid certain decisions moving forward. So that's a very common approach. The union wants to make sure that they're as transparent as they can be in getting word out to employees. One, that we're here. Two, we can help. Three, we can help you. We've got a lot of experience. We've got a lot of money. We want to help you in any way that you need help so that you can bring us in. Unions have a financial interest here, for sure. The union that's organizing JPL, based on what I'm reading, appears to be the United Auto Workers Union,
Mhm.
which doesn't seem to fit.
So
But
that was going to be a later question of mine. And now all of that is assuming that NASA is not excluded from coverage of the National Labor Relations Act, correct?
well, NASA would probably be excluded from the National Labor Relations Act to the extent that NASA employees are considered government employees.
Right. Okay.
Government employees are excluded. So then the question is, can they organize under the Federal Labor Management Relations Program? There's exclusions there for national security interests and things like
Okay.
that. And
Okay.
that's where the Trump executive orders from March and August come into play.
Okay.
And those are, whether the Trump administration is correct or not is likely to be decided at some point, either in the courts or politically. There's been an effort over the course of the last month to all Democratic senators and one Republican senator challenging the authority and trying to pass legislation that would, in fact, nullify that.
Okay. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is there a history? Are there historical examples of an administration getting that directly involved in these labor rights?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm reading this, and a lot of this stuff happened before I became a lawyer, but this law that the legislators are operating under, to a certain extent, is called, the new act is the Protect America's Workers Act, and it relates to a 1978 Civil Service Reform Act that banned unions at most federal agencies under this blanket of, national security. And that's what Trump is using to invalidate labor contracts and to restrict the
Okay.
ability of people to organize. Within the last week or two, there's the Protect America Workers Act, which has been introduced in the interest of correcting that, or trying to correct or address that. And ultimately, I think that this goes to the courts to resolve. And courts are
Okay.
a mixed bag right now. They've become very political, and that's somewhat challenging to predict what's going to happen.
Okay. So, but that would be for the civil service employees, not the JPL employees who are probably private
Yeah, and
employees of Caltech.
the JPL employees, to the extent that they're private
Yeah.
employees of a company or an entity that is not the government, they are likely would be covered under the National Labor Relations Act as opposed to the Federal Labor Management Relations Program. And I don't believe that the president would have as much authority as exercised over federal employees and their rights
Okay.
to unionize. I think that, one is that, it's the executive branch of the government is in control of the operations of the government. We're dealing here with private employers with an act of Congress, and that, I think, gives it a little bit more, perhaps more stability and certainly more force and more difficult to mess with, if you will.
Okay.
To use a legal term, mess with.
Yeah. 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 Well, it raises separation of powers, if not legal issues, certainly philosophical ones, all the way down to the water cooler, for the lack of a better term. So, okay. So we've got the United Auto Workers. Why? I have to imagine that would confuse a lot of people. Why is that? Like, y- huh?
You know, to a certain extent, I've told you that unions are the people that are
Mm,
involved. People have connections, people have relationships, and it seems to me that the union that can give structure to that group of people who want to organize a union can vary. I mean, they all largely do the same thing, and they don't necessarily need to have expertise in the area in order to organize the employees. They're all experts in organizing employees, but
okay.
United Auto Workers, the Teamsters are involved in lots of different things. There's a union called the United Electrical Workers that, because of their organizing strategies, they're now called the Union for Everyone. They're not just
Hmm.
electrical workers. So I
Okay.
wouldn't pay too much attention to that. I think that somebody had a contact. The union said, "Hey, that's an opportunity for us," and the United Auto Workers thought, "Let's get involved. We can use more members."
Mm,
And if we get more members, that means that we get more dues, and that helps perpetuate
sure.
the union to do what it wants to do and what it feels like it needs to do.
So that leads to, well, to me, it leads to a question of, if I hear what you're saying about the unions, specific unions being not interchangeable so much, but substitutable into different organizations for overall shared goals. But the obvious question to me is given the, and maybe the answer is it doesn't matter because it's still labor versus management, or I should say, hopefully labor and management. It still seems to me that the why would a union that large be so concerned with an organization with less than 5,000 employees? Certainly, only a fraction of which would be interested. Is it well, why?
Why? They've been asked.
Okay, I mean that's a
One,
good enough reason.
they have a mission. They need more members to continue to do what they do, and this is kind of a cool place. So
Okay,
that may
I think
be
so.
maybe all they need there. It's not like, a lot of I represent grocery stores. A lot of the unions are
Uh,
the United Food and Commercial Workers, of course,
okay,
but
yeah,
that doesn't mean they have to be.
I see.
I mean, the idea is the people themselves provide the information to the union about what's important, what their priorities are, what their concerns are, what their needs
Okay,
are. And unions are pretty good at soliciting that and then turning that into something that becomes a proposal in collective bargaining.
I see. So that takes me to another question I had, which is under the Labor Relations Act, two people are all it takes to create certain rights, correct? Now, that's not the same as having actual bargaining power, which you would need, I would imagine, a significant fraction of your employees in a normal organization where it's money in, money out, marketplace type stuff, right? Like, so I think that's an important distinction. What the legal rights are with just two versus what two people are not likely to move the needle on a 5,000 person organization of any kind,
No,
right?
two people, though, can start the ball rolling
Sure,
and
sure.
engaging in protected concerted activity. But ultimately, what has to happen is that they have to define a collective bargaining unit. So it's all professional engineering employees at such and
Mhm.
such company. And that might be a group of, let's say it's a group of 200 people. In order to get the National Labor Relations Board interested, you have to establish a showing of interest of at least 30% of that group in order to
Okay.
even support a petition for an election. Most
Okay.
unions that I know of will not even file for an election unless they've got 55, 60% of the employees involved. The
Okay.
protected concerted activity is one concept, but in terms of actually organizing a union, it's all based on numbers. And you want to get that election there petition filed, and then you want to make sure that you encourage enough people or persuade enough people to support you to win the election when it's held.
So that would be, so when you say election, you mean the actual formation of the almost a instance of the United Auto Workers Union
Yeah, like
at a JPL.
a local,
Okay, like a branch, like for
like a
lack of a better
branch, if you
term.
will.
Okay. So it's really its own thing that kind of brings the resources, I imagine paperwork for a lack, a template almost for a successful organization, right? Coming from
Right.
UAW. Okay, got
And
it.
we're,
Okay.
and we're seeing more and more professionals engage in
Yeah.
unionization.
Well, I hear about it a lot in medicine.
Employees
Yeah.
International Union is organizing residents and interns at medical training centers.
Interesting. Yeah. That is a separate conversation.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Okay, so let's sort of wind down to this current situation where you have the organizers with the website up and the institution with the website up. So how does a undecided person at this organization balance the two and make sense of it?
Well, it's interesting. I went to the website that JPL put up within the last few days, and there's a phrase in journalism called "If your mother says she loves you, check it out." So the reporters are telling people that don't accept it, don't learn more, dig behind the surface, and that's kind of what we have under both situations. People need to recognize that the union site is there to advance the interests of the union, and the company site if you go to the first page, says, we support our employees' choice and that we're working together well and collaborating. But you go a little bit deeper into that, and the company site says, we don't think a union's the right thing for us right now, and we don't think it's going to help us navigate through the challenges facing us. So you got to go to those websites and probably visit both of them, learn as much as you can about unionization, about the issues that are involved, about your options. I think the company has created this website to provide, it's just like a podcast, you want to be the source of good information, and you want to provide options and information to folks.
Yes.
The company's doing that. The union's doing that as well. The union has the union twist of, either the company's evil or it's doing things that are not in your interest, or it's time for you to band together because the government's coming after us. We're going to lose jobs, and we can help protect that. The company's interest is, this is a difficult time. You have the right to do all these things if you want to. We can't stop you from doing this. It's your choice. But we'd like you not to choose to do this. And so learn as much as you can. It's more focused on education. And depending on how this runs, if there's a campaign going on, which appears to be the case, normally you wouldn't see two websites. You want the employees to learn as much as they can, because it's an important decision going forward.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to wind down. That is exactly my goal here with this podcast, is hopefully provide some information and perspective, and talk about the larger issues at play, which again, in the case of NASA and JPL, are very unusual and hard to nail down. I think that that's a good place to stop. Any closing thoughts in this new world?
It's hard to predict, hard to navigate, but hang in there, read as much as you can, learn as much as you can about your options, do what you can do to protect yourself and your families. Understand that, at least in your world, Jeff, this is a very unique situation, very complex situation. It's not, we're going to organize the local Safeco store. This is a big deal, and organization becomes even more difficult when you're dealing with professional workers who all they want to do is do their job. And
nobody wants to be doing this.
Nobody wants to be doing this. They don't want to have to do this. They really just want to think about what's next and how can we do this impossible thing that we've done 14 times before, but now we have a new twist. And it'd be nice to be able to return to that, so that people can just simply work on the projects that we need to become and to maintain our position within the universe as to everything that we stand for. So it's a unique situation, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to talk with you this morning on these types of things.
Well, thank you. I think we'll certainly have more to discuss in coming weeks and months, and maybe we can have another conversation.
Absolutely.
But with that, this has been the Space Madness Podcast with your host, Jeff Nosnov, John Anderson from Hush Blackwell, and good luck to everybody, and we'll see what happens. I hate to end things that way, but I've got no other conclusions. So good luck to everybody. Thanks again.